Right. So if there's something you want to say to me to set me off or get me to go on a bit of a rant, just try and convince me. I'll get a card table and put a sign on the other side that says relationships can be built virtually. Change my mind. And I'm going to talk about why, and I'm going to add a lot of clarity around this because I have had no shortage of misunderstandings. But hear me out in this. And by the way, if you're watching this or you've seen other content of mine and you're getting value out of it, be sure to like and subscribe it. I know a lot of people who are watching it, I can tell by the stats, by the way, aren't subscribed, and it'll help me get my content out there to help other folks. So with that, let's transition over to this whole virtual relationship thing, which given the last few years is probably at the peak of things. But one of the things I hear all the time in the workplace that is just, it drives me up a wall is when people say there's just something about being together. And it happens all the time at work, and it drives me nuts because I always go, what? What is it that happens? And it's always bothered me. This didn't just start in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. I have always been irritated by this idea that some sort of magical spell is cast when people get in the room together, and you'll hear things like, oh, there's water cooler conversations or collaboration or hanging out. And it's such vague, non-specific things. And as someone who specializes in human behavior change, I can't tolerate that because I have to understand, well, what actually is it? And the reality is, over the years, I have seen we fundamentally misunderstand what actually makes a really strong relationship. And I'm talking the kind of relationship that sticks through thick or thin, gets you with that person who you can trust, who you can actually lean into. And let me just tell you straight up, many of my closest friends and connections, I've actually never met. It's not the kind of thing where we were really close, we had close proximity, that magic spell was cast over us, and then something happened in our lives and we went our separate ways. Many of my close relationships are with people we've never even been in the same continent sometimes as each other. And if people say, and I've had people go, well, that's just not possible. Well, yeah, it is. Yeah, it actually is completely possible. In fact, I would go so far as to say, unless the relationship you're talking about requires physically touching each other, like unless your relationship requires you to embrace or smell or taste things together, which there's not a whole lot of situations I can even imagine in my head where I would go, yeah, that's a requirement for a strong relationship. Are they there? Yeah, I can be convinced that they exist. But at work, no, no. So especially when I hear this conversation related to workplace performance, it really sends me off a ledge because the reality is you can build strong, collaborative, cohesive, whatever adjective you want to associate with it, relationships without ever being in the same room. So with that, now let me clarify something, because sometimes when people hear me talk about this, they get a little antsy and they say, so what? You're suggesting we shouldn't get together? Is that the stance you're taking? That is absolutely not what I am saying. That is not what I'm saying. Let me clarify this as many times as I need to make sure nobody ever quotes and says, Christopher Lynn said you actually should avoid getting together. And no, I mean, unless you're spreading diseases and things like that, yeah, then you probably shouldn't. But I'm not suggesting that if you're in the same location, you should go stay in different houses or offices and go back to your cube. That is not what I mean. What I mean is the way the world works and the complexity of our lives and the reality of the benefits we have with technology is proximity should never be a limiting factor. We should never go, you know what? We would have a good relationship. I would invest, but darn it, we just can't get to. If you have that luxury, take advantage of it, but be careful. And I'm going to tell you why, because complacency can kick into this. So again, I've made it very clear where I stand on this. It's not avoid proximity. It's stop believing that proximity has to be some magic variable to make a relationship work. The other thing I'm going to say, because I talk to people and they go, well, I've tried this. It doesn't really work. Skill building, it's a skill. Excuse me, virtual relationships, it's a skill. If you haven't had good luck with it, you don't have the skill. You just don't. I've had people come to me and go, well, I've tried this whole thing and it didn't work. Well, it's probably because you're not very good at that. And that's just the reality of it. But there's good news in that. There's really good news in that, guess what? Any skill can be built. You can build skills. So if you're saying, yeah, I tried the virtual relationship thing, it sucked. Yeah, probably did because you probably weren't very good at it. Probably like if I asked you to go ride a bike for the first time in your life, you got really hurt, or go pick up a skateboard you've never ridden before. You probably got hurt. Over time, you will get better at it. It's a lack of skill, but take heart, you can build it. And that's part of what I'm going to try and do with this, is try and help you see how do you build that skill, because you can. I can say from firsthand experience. So let's get into it on some of the most basic things. This isn't going to be the comprehensive guide to building virtual relationships, but it's going to give you some really practical stuff that's going to help you do it. The first one is making the time. And you may go, well, that's pretty big. Yeah, it is really basic. But here's the thing, like any skill, if you don't make time to work at this, and I mean like make time to work at it, it will never get any better. I really want to emphasize the making time, because the reality is this doesn't just happen. And especially if you're talking about virtual relationships, it really doesn't just happen. We were already really, in my opinion, my observations, we were really crappy at building relationships before we were in this virtual digital world. We were really, quite frankly, terrible at it. The pandemic just highlighted how bad we really were and how oblivious we were to the fact that our relationships weren't that great. Look back pre-pandemic, how much time people were spending together at work. They were in this magic environment where the gold dust is in the air and the relationships should just be blossoming left and right. And yet, pandemic hits, some space happens, there's nothing there. And the reality is, this is the risk I say when you're dealing with proximity, can be a little bit of a blinder to you, and that you can assume, well, we're around each other. If I were to count the hours I was with these people, it's a lot of hours. We must have a great relationship. Wrong, because you're not making the time. You're not being intentional about that time. And I think that's one of the really important things, is the intentionality behind it. Just because you're around each other, just because you're in the room together, just because you happen to eat lunch together even, does not mean that you've built a strong relationship. And being intentional about that time is critical. And the reality is, when you're intentional about it, it does not need to be this ridiculous, inordinate amount of time. Okay. It's not something that you have to go, good grief. So you're saying building relationships required a ridiculous amount of time. Now virtual relationships require even more time. I don't have enough time as it stands. Well, the reality is, first of all, you need to make time for it. We all have the same 24 hours. But the thing is, if you're intentional about this, this does not need to be some crazy thing you're investing loads and loads of time in. The key, though, is consistency. And later on, I'm going to talk about how you can diversify your approach to make the most of that time so that it doesn't have to be a huge time suck. And again, like many of my things, I'm going to lean on technology to show you can think differently, do this flexibly, you can do this relatively quickly, but without the consistency, it's going to fall short. So if you do it just like the gym, you go to the gym once, you never go back. Well, guess what? You're not getting in shape. Even if you go to the gym not very long, but you're there and you're consistent and you're sticking with it, over time, you'll get in shape. And I think that's just one of the biggest things. Now, I will also say this is harder than you think. And I'm going to talk about how to make it easier, but I think the difficulty, it's less of a difficulty thing. It's this intentionality on making the time for it. One way you get around this when it comes to making the time, schedule it. If you don't schedule time for this, if you don't set aside time, you're like, oh, I'll get to it. You won't. When's the last time you, I don't know, think of something that you've wanted to change that you just haven't? And I bet if you think about it, when you look at making time for it, it's something that you consistently go, yeah, I really should. I'll get to that tomorrow, next week, the week after that. And pretty soon, 6 months, a year has gone by and you haven't done it. And so that's the difficulty, is getting into the routine, getting used to it. But I'm telling you, once, just like the gym, once you get used to using these muscles, it becomes more consistent. That difficulty section, kind of, you move out of it. So making the time, simple step, but one of the most important. And it's really about consistency, not volume of time. So with that, let me talk about the other piece that I think can be really helpful. And this is focusing on the relationship. Now, you might say, isn't this whole thing about virtual relationship, isn't it a little obvious that we would be focusing on the relationship? It apparently isn't, because a lot of times we think, just like we thought, hey, I was in the office with these people all the time, we must have great relationships. Oh, turns out we have no relationship. It's really about focusing and being intentional on the relational piece. And one of the things that I have often seen over the years, this goes back to this office analogy. Just because you're engaging with people doesn't mean it's relationship building. And this drives me nuts in learning and development around team building. It's like, hey, let's get everybody together and we'll do a thing. And by doing that thing, it's going to make things better. And it can, but not necessarily. And so just because you're engaging with each other doesn't mean it's happening. Now, even the team building is a step beyond what often happens, which, if you actually analyze most of your relationships, you will often find, especially in ones that you may think are strong that actually aren't that strong, they're very transactional. I need something, I engage with this person. They need something from me, we engage. When we engage, it's only about the thing we need from each other. Very transactional. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's actually a relationship you need to foster and develop, that's a very bad thing. If you have a transactional relationship with that individual, you don't actually have any relationship of meaning. So I'm going to really emphasize that don't assume volume of transactions means quality of relationship. It doesn't. Now, so how do you go outside of that other than, okay, well, one, there's the consistency. So being sure to connect with people consistently, even if you don't, oh, I need to go talk to them about this. I need to engage with them with this, but also getting to know them on an individual level. And this is true of work relationships, which thankfully over the last few years, I have seen the lines start to converge between work life and personal life. Personally, I've never understood why we separate the two, but that's me. And so now I'm starting to see this become more of a normative thing where, before it was a little taboo if you engaged with work and personal at the same venue. Now it's like, okay, that's a little more common practice. But don't just focus on that. And I see this all the time in work transaction and even intentional attempts to build oh, we're going to be more intentional and focus on collaboration, but it's only about work. And I know nothing about you as an individual. I don't know anything about your life. I don't know anything about what makes you tick. I'm operating off assumptions that are only built on what I know about you at work. You can get started with this by just asking open-ended questions and not just, why do you work here? Right? Like, how did you get this job? Like, not that kind of stuff. Like, actually get to know, what do you like to do outside of work? Tell me a little bit about that. Building up on that. And you can build up with this. You don't need to start with, tell me about some of your deepest childhood tragedy. Like, I hope I don't have to make that clarification. But if I do, don't go deep right away. That's the creep factor that's going to make somebody pull back and go, who is this asking me these kind of questions? Asking those common open-ended questions. Honestly, a perfect example of one I just mentioned that works really well is like, what do you like to do outside of work? You would be amazed how quickly people open up to that, almost in like they're caught off guard, but in a good way. Like, wow, I wasn't expecting to get asked that. And people love to talk about this stuff because in general, a lot of people don't love their work. Some do. I happen to be one of them, but a lot of people don't love it. And even the people who do love it, myself included, it's not the only thing I love to talk about. So asking people this and getting them out, the other thing it does is it helps you find common ground with those people. I think of a conversation I had not that long ago with an IT partner. And as I asked him what he likes to do outside of work, turns out he's a big skateboarder. I shared how on my 40th birthday, I decided with my kids, I was going to learn to skateboard. Before you knew it, we had this whole common ground around skateboarding. We now stay in touch about what we're doing. He's always asking, hey, how's your ollie going? Have you been able to, right? And it's become this thing. And we would have never had that had I not taken the time to ask, what do you like to do outside of work? That's something that can be such an easy way to do it. And then you can build these things up, become closer. They can become more personal over time. Don't start there, though. The other thing is, I will just tell you, appreciate the fact not every interaction is going to be great. Okay. You're not going to walk out of every intentional conversation or interaction with someone and go, wow, like that just, so our relationship just met a new level of depth. And that's okay. It doesn't have to. I think sometimes we have this perfection metric that we're shooting for. Like, okay, I listened to this video. I'm going to be more intentional about this. I'm going to go into this. Wow, that one was really awkward and sucked. I felt a little weird. Maybe this doesn't work. And this is a lot of what I see when I talk to people. Go, oh yeah, I tried the virtual thing. It didn't work. How many times did you try? I mean, if you can really get to it, a lot of times it's not very much, and they usually quit pretty quick. So recognize you're going to ask some awkward questions. You're going to realize, oh, I thought we might have some common ground there. It didn't really go there. But don't quit. Going back to making the time, it's about consistency. And this is true even in personal relationships. You see this. There's times you hang out with people that you're close with that you go, yeah, that wasn't really all that like monumental, but you still move forward with it. And be okay with some of the awkwardness, especially when you first get started. I will just share with you, I do a lot of virtual coffees with people where people who are in my network, in my sphere that, I need to build relationships, whether it's just kind of distant relationships or close relationships with. I have a lot of these virtual coffees. And let me tell you, when I first start engaging on these things, sometimes they can be really awkward. People may not be expecting you to ask, what do you like to do outside of work? If they're not familiar with that kind of engagement with somebody, maybe that they've just met, maybe they're not super social, it can be a little awkward. Like, oh, so come prepared to share more about yourself. This is not, again, a transaction where you go, well, I'm asking you a question, you give me an answer. I'll wait till you ask a question, then I'll give you an. Come prepared to share and talk and collaborate with people. And that it's going to be awkward sometimes, just like not every interaction is going to be this mind-blowing, monumental change that you're going to have. Now, here's something else that I'm going to say, because if you've been listening to the time and the focus and the attention on getting to know people on a more holistic level, you might go, good grief, for everyone? No, I am not saying or suggesting that every relationship that you have needs to be deep and meaningful, and you always need to go to this level of depth where you know all this personal detail about. That's not what I'm saying. First of all, there's not enough time in the day to do that. I mean, I think about how many tens of thousands connections I have. If I tried to do that with everyone, I wouldn't be able to focus on my family. So yes, you need to have priorities of like, where do these relationships sit? But you can apply all of these things regardless of where the level is. Is there any harm in knowing a little bit more and what common ground you may have with someone that maybe you're not super close with, but you do have incidental interactions with them? And hey, this might make that next interaction a little less awkward when you know something personal about them that you can bring up in the conversation. Not every relationship is created equal, though, and that's okay. The other thing to note is these levels of depth may change over time. There may be seasons where certain relationships need to be really tight and seasons where that tightness can separate. And that's okay. And you don't need to necessarily call all that out. Again, you're shifting your intentionality, your consistency around what the relationship really needs to be. And you don't need to feel like, wow, okay, so if I'm doing this, everyone I know now is on this list of intentionality. That can be exhausting. And I can just tell you that as an introvert, the thought of me having to intentionally get to know deep relationships with every single person, first of all, I wouldn't have enough time. Second of all, it would completely wipe me out. All right, coming into the home stretch on this, here's just some tips for how to get good at this, is really in diversifying your approach around this. A lot of times when people think of virtual whatever collaboration, they immediately jump to either just social media or Zoom, video meeting type of things. In a work environment, typically very much like the Zoom meeting. Oh, work relationship, we build through, Zoom meetings. Personal, social media. This is the thing that I see so often, is that, what? Most people are very limited in their approaches, and it's actually holding you back. If you're only thinking of one or two things and going, well, that doesn't work, so I guess it won't work. You know what? There's a ton of diversity in this. Now, that being said, I want to be really careful that you don't write something off because you had a bad sample of this. So you also have to think, what are we trying to accomplish? Can sitting on a Zoom be really awkward? Yes. Yes, it can. Can it also be extremely deep and meaningful? And can you have a conversation with someone that goes into a depth that you would have? Yeah, you actually can. And believing that you can't is actually holding you back, because I've had some seriously deep conversations with people in this kind of environment where they're on the other side of the screen, I'm here, and we're just being honest and vulnerable and talking about what's going on. Now, Is Zoom for everything? I don't think so. Like some of the things I've seen people try and do, like, oh, hey, we're gonna do is we're gonna set the iPad up on the kitchen island and leave it on while we're walking around the kitchen. Terrible experience. If you're on the other end, you're going, does anybody pay attention? So you got to think, like, what are you really trying to accomplish? But don't package some of these approaches into this one size fits all. Well, it didn't work here, so it doesn't work at all. No, think about what you're trying to do. And this goes back to the intentionality of relationship building. What are you really trying to accomplish in that? And then what is the best way to pull that off? One huge thing that I have found wild success with is video messaging apps. I use an app called Volley where I can exchange asynchronous video messages back and forth with people. And I use it for work. I use it for personal. I use it for a lot of things because the reality is my life is moving a million miles a minute. And oftentimes the idea of sitting down and actually planting time to just one-on-one interact, I don't have time for it. And so sometimes but do I do it? I absolutely still do it. I'm just more intentional about it. So what do I do to fill in the cracks? Going back to the consistency and making time, I can't always schedule 30 minutes, 60 minutes to sit down with someone. But what I can do is use my video messaging app to bounce things off of people while still getting that human connection, being able to see them seeing me, hearing the tone of my voice, my emotions. The other thing that's really unique about these video messaging apps is I can send messages from anywhere. So while most people who've been on a Zoom with me recognize this background, most people wouldn't recognize my basement. Although if you're on my YouTube channel, you've probably seen it in shorts. You might not recognize my playground or where I go do, lift weights, things like that. With the video messaging app, because I can do this stuff on the fly, people actually start getting a lens into my life that they wouldn't normally have. What's also interesting about this, going back to building relationships, is you actually can invite people into your life in ways you could not when you relied on proximity. So to give an example of this, I had a good friend, went on vacation to an amazing place, and through that vacation, they sent me volleys while they were on vacation of different destinations, short little video messages letting me know, hey, I was thinking about you because I saw this and da-da-da, and here I am. I felt like I was on the trip with them. We had something to talk about with their trip other than them just telling me about it. So here was a wildly different, flexible way of approaching live-ish interaction in a very personal way. I mean, come on, folks. I get that people don't talk on the phone very much, myself included, but hearing someone's voice, there are different ways you can do it. Now, I also don't want to write off things like texting, but be intentional about it. If you're going, well, this relationship isn't really working. Well, what do? Well, we text. Okay, probably not going to be enough to actually sustain and maintain a strong relationship. Does it have a place for, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while? Just to give you some insight into my way of operating. Some people, I volley a lot, then they get busy. They forget to check it. They forget to send a message. So I text them, send a volley, say, check the volley, then they send a volley back, right? It's about the intentionality and interconnection of all of these different things. Now, one last thing I want to address on this one is one of the things that became really popular in the pandemic that I say, just be careful with it. Playing games or doing like watch parties, VR, things like that. Can they be really powerful? Yes. I have Monopoly on my iPad. I love playing Monopoly. I love Monopoly, by the way. And so I love that because it's got a built-in thing where I can do video messaging with people that I'm playing with. Absolutely love it. What I have to be careful of is that I don't assume because we had a game night once a week, we have a strong relationship. Because if I do, it goes back to that when we were in person in the office and doing whatever, we assume that, well, we got together, so our relationship must be great. Wrong. Just because we played Monopoly and sat around, does that necessarily mean I got to know you? Well, no, maybe not. In fact, it might have even been less because there were 4 of us and we weren't actually talking because there was too much going on, paying attention to, oh, snap, I landed on Boardwalk and I'm out of money now. All right, you get the gist of this. So I think, again, it all comes back to thinking critically, leveraging a suite of technology, focusing on the individual and the relationship, and then just making time and being consistent. So with that, I'm going to close this out. Hopefully this makes you think slightly differently about what it means to build relationships in the virtual world. And again, if you still don't believe me, message me. We'll talk live. I will change your mind on that. So with that, hope you have a great one.